Welcome back to Learning with Merit. Today we're talking about data types in Java, and we're going to take a look at some reference types, which we typically think of as classes and objects. So if we look here, what we can see is that these reference data types in Java are non-primitives and are typically defined in some way outside of Java. And you can make your own types, as we will talk about here. So they can be used to call methods to perform certain operations. So if we define some type of function we want to have, we can use these to call those functions. They default to what we call null, meaning nothing, and this is going to be very important later in Java. These things are going to be classes, interface, enums, all types of different things in Java. Right now we're going to mostly focus on classes, and don't worry, we'll get to the rest of those later. And then these objects are what we call an instance of a class. So we'll talk, of course, more about those later as well. We just want to look at the different data types that we have today. So here are our common reference types in Java. We have strings, which will be very commonly used for you. This is like text that you want to use. We have arrays, which are like a list of something. We have multi-dimensional arrays, which if you remember from math class, you may have talked about matrices before, or a matrix. Multi-dimensional arrays sort of look like that. Or you could also sort of think of multi-dimensional arrays as an array that stores other arrays, right? And then we have array lists, which are like arrays, of course, and you can have, of course, multi-dimensional array lists as well. These array lists are going to be special and a little bit different from arrays, and we'll talk more about that later as well. Then we have something called a hash map. Now, a hash map is sort of like a mapping. We call it of key to key value pairs. So we have a key and a value, and those two things go together. You may have heard these things called dictionaries before, especially if you're from another language. And then any custom class we can think of as a reference type. And so, for example, data types up here is a custom class that I have written, and it is going to be a reference type. And here we are defining what that data types class does, and it's not really that special at the moment. So let's look at what we got with these. So strings. So the syntax for a string is we're going to provide the type, and then here we have the variable name or the identifier for this value. This is the actual literal string right here. This is a string, and we need to make sure that we put that text inside of double quotes and not single quotes, especially if we're coming from another language like Python, of course. Arrays, our syntax for these is there are sort of two ways we can create an array. If we're going to store them in variables, we are going to declare this is the type of data. So we're going to say we're going to store primitive integer values in an array. That's what the square brackets are for. Here we give an identifier. Then we say new to create a new place in memory for this array. And then we say int. And inside of the square brackets here, we're going to give the value for the length we want that array to be. And in this particular case, the default value of an integer is going to be 0. So we'll have an array of length 5 that stores 5 zeros, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And then here's another way that we can do this. Of course, we start out the same way. We say we want to store integer in an array. We'll call this our integer array or our init array. This is an array initializer here. And what we're doing is we are putting the actual values inside these curly braces that we want to appear inside of the array. In this case, this is an array of length 6. And it stores the values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we will talk more about all of these, of course, later. We look at a multi-dimensional array. It's not that much different from what we just saw in our regular array. In this case, we're saying we want to store integers in an array of arrays. We'll call this array2d as our identifier. We'll create a new place in memory. Now we're going to tell what length we want each of them to be. The array that contains the other arrays will be of length 5, and each of those arrays that are stored will be of length 5. Here's another way we could do it. Maybe it makes a little bit more sense. If we look at this one right here, we are, of course, saying I want to make an array of arrays that stores integers. Then we have init array2d. We're going to initialize this two-dimensional array, and what we have is we have an array That's our outer curly braces here. You can see that this one gets highlighted as well as this one, and it stores this array and one more. So our size for the first part is 2, and for the second part is going to be 5. And we're storing these integer values in each of them. Of course, we'll talk more about those in the future. Next, we have array lists. So these are very important for creating things that have different lengths when you're talking about a list. If you want to change the length of a list, right, you have to use an array list as opposed to something like an array. They're very useful, but we're going to have to import them with java.util.ArrayList. So if we scroll up here to the top, you'll see that we've already done that, java.util.ArrayList right there. And then it says it can only store objects. Objects meaning reference types here. We cannot store any primitives, and we'll talk about that a little more later as well. But here's our syntax. We're going to say we want to create an array list. We're going to say we want to put integer data types inside of this array list, inside the angle brackets here. Then we are going to call it list for the identifier, create a new place in memory, and then we will construct or build the array list in that spot in memory. And of course, it starts out as an empty array list. The next one here, this is called our hash map or our dictionary if you're coming from another language. You need to make sure that you import the java.util.hashmap. If we scroll up here, we'll see that we did import java.util.hashmap. And then the syntax for this, we have hashmap, because I want to make a new hashmap. I'm going to tell it what the key and value data types will be. So the key will be a string data type, and the value will also be a string data type, separated by a comma, and we have that all in angle brackets there. I'm going to give it an identifier, in this case map, new to create a new place in memory, and then we are going to construct it with hash map, angle brackets, and parentheses there, and that will create a new hash map with no values in it, of course, of length 0. So these are our reference data types, very common reference data types. Of course, there are more, but these are the most commonly ran into and used in Java. And as you get better, you will learn about more of them. So remember that strings, arrays, array lists, and hash maps. And of course, most important, any custom class is also a reference type in Java. So that means any class that you run into is also a reference type. Thank you for watching Learning with Merit.